Welcome to Testify. Today we take a look at the book of 2 Corinthians. Let's begin. After Paul had set up the church in Corinth in the book of Acts, he heard that things were not going well in the church of Corinth. Thereafter he writes the first letter to the Corinthians, that we call 1 Corinthians. In this letter, he addresses many issues in the Corinth church. He addresses division in the church, sexual immorality, marriage, spiritual gifts, lawsuits, and serving of the Lord's Supper. After the church in Corinth read this letter, they had a few issues with Paul and rebelled against his teachings. Paul then visits the church, which he calls a painful visit, and after much disappointment, he writes the letter called 2 Corinthians. Paul opens up the letters first thanking God. He thanks God for the peace and encouragement he provided to him and the Corinthians during the time of his dispute. Paul tells the Corinthians that he has forgiven them and wants to reconcile with them. So why did the Corinthians disregard Paul? The Corinthians disregarded Paul as their leader because he was poor and earned only a humble living through manual labor, he was under constant persecution, often homeless, and he wasn't a very impressive public speaker. Because Corinthians were exposed to other more wealthy and impressive Christian leaders, they started to think less of Paul and eventually became ashamed of him. Paul responds to this elevation of other leaders because of wealth and success. Paul depicts himself and the other apostles as captive slaves to King Jesus, who's leading a life of triumph. Paul states that his job isn't to be impressive, but rather to direct people to Jesus. The church in Corinth requested letters of recommendation from Paul to prove his credentials. Paul responds to that as being silly, because he started the church in Corinth. He then goes on by quoting Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and states that God's Spirit has assisted in writing the letter called 2 Corinthians, and that is proof enough. Paul states that the laws of the covenant during Moses were ineffective at truly transforming Israel. The new covenant, however, is even more glorious, because the resurrected Jesus is the glory of God. He lives on forever, and his Spirit is transforming people to become more faithful like himself. After all, Jesus' glorious exaltation as King of the world took place through his suffering, execution, and death. On the cross, Jesus revealed God's salvation as he died for the sins of the world, reconciling people to God. And even more, Jesus revealed God's character. The Father is a being of self-giving, suffering love that seeks the well-being of others. Paul explains that his way of life and leadership is actually the proof that he authentically represents the crucified and risen Jesus. Paul moves on to address the Corinthians' forgotten generosity. The hope was that these churches would send a relief gift to churches in Jerusalem who had fallen into poverty, as a symbol of their unity in the Messiah Jesus. While many churches were indeed thrilled to give, the Corinthians, in the midst of all this conflict with Paul, forgot to save up for the gift. For Paul, this wasn't only about the money. It was another sign that the Corinthians had not been transformed by the gospel, which is a story of generosity. Paul then speaks about the rich leaders who came to Corinth promoting themselves and bad-mouthing Paul as a poor, unsuccessful leader. At the risk of sounding self-promoting, Paul says that if these guys want to compare credentials, he can totally take them on. Were the rich preachers Jewish Bible experts? Well, so is Paul. He was a Pharisee. And he has the entire Bible memorized. Do they brag about their superior knowledge of Jesus? Well, Paul has actually seen and spent time with the risen Jesus himself, and he has even had visions of Jesus' heavenly throne room. More importantly, Paul has given his entire life to the mission of Jesus, sacrificing comfort and stability and never asking the Corinthians for money. Paul concludes the letter to 2 Corinthians by asking them to examine their hearts. He states they are not living like transformed followers of Jesus should be, so he invites them, once again, to humble themselves before the grace and love of Jesus. That brings us to the end of the book of 2 Corinthians. Hope you are grasping as much as you can. We also emphasize the importance of reading Scripture. This is no replacement but merely a summary on each book. Thank you, take care.